Well, it's so fitting, and it's such a pleasure to end this marathon of aphasia teaching with one of our founding members, Aura Kagan. I'm sure she needs no introduction, but I'm going to take a couple of minutes anyway, just to recognize her as one of the founding members of Aphasia Access, as an inspiration to us all. I think no one thinks of aphasia centers or participation work without her name and her legacy being forefront in our minds. So it's just terrific that we get to call on her to close us out in this marathon. I do want to just take a quick moment though and read the text that was written about her by the Tavistock Trust for aphasia when she received her Robin Tavistock Award this year, because I think the text is just so beautiful. So forgive me, Aura, but I just want to share this for those who haven't seen that website. So the Trust wrote, "That which Dr. Aura Kagan has contributed to the world of aphasia, to the quality of life of people with aphasia, cannot be underestimated. The influence goes way beyond the borders of Canada. People travel from all over the world to learn from and emulate what's happening in Toronto. Many aphasia centers around the world acknowledge that their model and inspiration come from what Aura, along with her staff team and volunteers, has achieved at the Aphasia Institute. And to put it quite simply, Dr. Aura Kagan is one of Canada's national treasures. The ripple effect of what Dr. Kagan has done and is doing will carry on forever." Gosh, it makes me wish I was Canadian or to be part of that community. Anyway, thank you for taking the time to close out this 24-hour teach-in, and I will leave you to it. Thank you. So this has been a pretty miraculous 24 hours, right?
It so has, that is for sure. You know, I think we have found a way. And the best part is how we've taken it through a couple of twists and a couple of turns and kept the community together, and how even overnight, you know, there were some diehards that stayed on the line all night, and that was pretty darn cool. You know, especially when we just didn't know what to expect in many ways. Just proved the one thing we knew, this power of this community.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't stay up all night, but I was several hours past my typical bedtime. So
yeah,
so I might just
me too, me three. I heard that Tom Sather stayed up until like 4 or 5, then caught a nap. And cheers to everyone else who did that, and cheers to our friends in Australia and other places where the time zones allowed them to stay up and carry the candle for all of us. I just saw Linda Worrell's post, "It's bedtime here, good night."
Yeah.
So do you have a favorite memory or a favorite thing that stands out from the last 23?
Gosh, you know, there's been so many. Tom and Barbara and I have been working behind the scenes to try and pull together some of the nuggets that we heard, and it's a rich set of insights and pieces of wisdom. You know, it was lovely to hear Audrey, of course, but there's the breadth of information we've had has been really terrific, you know, from sort of real key tips and tools and resources, and some amazing cutting edge and new research. So I don't think I've been at a conference that has, I mean, and this is a teach-in. It wasn't a call for papers or a peer-reviewed sort of conference, but the quality of the work we've been learning about is really remarkable.
Yeah, and I certainly don't want to downplay, and hey, we've got a call for papers coming out later this summer, hint, hint. But at the same token, I think one of the great powers has been the organic. we started with a simple concept. If you started a sign-up genius like they use for figuring out who's bringing snacks to the kindergarten Halloween party, I literally used my room parent account for this, that it can work. And I heard many people say the strength of this is as much as it would be under any other circumstance. And I that has been music to my ears. I see Aura's slide deck.
That's right.
And hopefully we can hear her, because I think that this is the Todd and Liz show is fun, but it's not why everybody's here. Aura, can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. We can see your slides. I think we got it.
Wonderful. And so I was prophesying what happened from between Liz's lovely introduction and my tech abilities. I'm not quite sure what happened. Anyway, let's go.
I think it was a little bit of karma from your note to tell Nina to break a leg.
All right.
All right.
So I just want to begin with some acknowledgements, always to the Aphasia Institute clients and families for sharing their lived experience, our staff and volunteers. I'm fortunate to work in the most inspiring environment. And I also want to take a minute to acknowledge conversations recently and over many years with health economist Dr. Jeffrey Hodge. So why this topic? Well, I've been interested for some time now, as many of you know, in what influences the variation we see in aphasia treatment and who makes aphasia treatment decisions. And this led me to think more about decision-making processes, the questions about this, and the involvement of our preferences and the issue of variation. And so I'm going to be starting with that. And then I will move on to some questions for all of us as a field. So I just want to present a caveat to you. These are very large, complex, and multifaceted topics. Each one of them could be a day on its own. My goal is just to raise issues and questions as a non-expert in this area. So the agenda, as I said, we'll talk first about variation, who makes treatment decisions in aphasia, why the concept of preferences in healthcare decisions is relevant to us, and how we get to actually understand the preferences of the individual with aphasia. And you can see that in bold. So let's begin with a talk about variation. A key incentive for the development of evidence-based medicine, or evidence-based practice, as many of us call it, was to reduce variation. But if you look at the literature, you'll see that variation is still a huge fact in medicine. There are many references to it in the literature. And what they're referring to is what is called unwarranted variation. That's variation in relation to identical problems. So depending on where you live and who you go to, you're going to get different treatments for the same problem. So is this why we seek second opinions? Most of us do this when we're faced with serious health-related issues. And ideally, we've got someone who understands our preferences and can help us weigh up the options. This is really the role of the good general practitioner, the GP. So what do you think, those of you listening? What do you think about second opinions and the potential role of a general practitioner for our field? Because variation is a fact. Some of the reasons for variation include where we trained, the influence of our mentors and teachers, different paradigms we align with, and different professional affiliations and values within paradigms. It's a fascinating study of a group of people working in mental health, all in the same paradigm, person-centered, but with social workers and psychiatrists. And their solutions, their interventions in relation to discharge were completely different, and they broke down along professional lines because they have different values related to risk. Another reason for variation is the system that we work in, what is rewarded, and of course our own values, which you'll hear me talk a lot about today. So values and what is valued, this is really important. It's how we make all our decisions, including, of course, clinical decisions. And values contribute to the variation that I've mentioned. We've talked about values for a long time in our field. If you go back to, 2000, 2001, there are articles, well-known articles by Sally Bing and Linda Worrell talking about the importance of values. It's a very complex area, though, because the terms values and value and what is valued, they're used in so many different ways. And we need to accept that there's not one widely accepted definition. You also know that there's huge difference between statements of value and what is actually valued. It's seen in what is rewarded. You just have to think for a minute about the statement of values you see in the elevator at a hospital, and then your experience as a patient. We are all patients or have been as well. So there are a range of things that may be considered values, for example, at the system level. But which of these are actually rewarded? Efficiency, cost effectiveness, equity, timeline, safety, patient-centeredness, patient experience. I think we would have our views on what is actually rewarded in those, amongst those values. So if we accept that there are variation in values, there are variations in treatments offered, who makes treatment decisions? So if we paint this scenario, in North America for sure, there are X weeks of treatment available, say 4, 6, 8, whatever, choose whatever you like. What we have to understand is that spending time on treatment X as an approach, or treatment A, means less time or no time on treatment approach B. So who gets to move that slider of how much time is spent on what? Increasingly, there is attention being paid, much more attention being paid to giving the patient or the client a role in moving that slider. It's becoming a requirement by many funders, and we know the literature tells us it's associated with better treatment outcomes and improved compliance with secondary prevention strategies, which, by the way, are so important and often not attended to sufficiently in our field. So in relation to aphasia, we know that in recent decades there's been increased recognition of the importance of aphasia therapy as a joint venture and including patients in the decision-making process. So I think we are in the stream of the right stream of thinking. We've seen it in the adoption of new terminology in our field, patient-centered care, relationship-centered care, and all of this clearly involves values and what is valued. Here are some examples of factors cited as influencing individual patient participation in the literature. They won't be a surprise to you. Knowledge and access to information by patients, access to systems or tools to support decision-making, maybe less familiar with that, and I'm going to talk a bit about it. Physical and cognitive ability, again, for aphasia, is that cognitive ability thing can raise red flags. Are people regarded as not able to make decisions because of their language problem? Emotional connections and actual experiences, prior experiences in relation to the healthcare services. But what role do we play as clinicians? What influences us? And what are we bringing along with us to the individual therapy encounter? What choices do we provide or not provide? And to what extent do we weigh up the risks, benefits, and trade-offs of aphasia treatment options together with our patients? So here again, the literature are some of the examples cited as influencing clinicians. That's not just speech pathologists, it's in healthcare, in terms of including patients. It's, what are the relationships like? Is there a recognition of patients' knowledge and experience? What is the attitude to considering patients as equal partners? The practical issue of allocation of time, and as always, coming back to beliefs and values as so important. So are there challenges for us in our field? Let's think for a moment and do some honest reflection. Is there sometimes a mismatch of values and comfort zone levels with various treatment options? Do we lack knowledge and or experience related to a potential range of treatment options? What is rewarded or restricted by our profession or system or place we work? So, for example, in some places, doing something like therapy or providing some kind of counseling is regarded as a value by speech language pathologists, but not allowed. And then finally, is there a lack of familiarity with the concept of personal preference and trade-offs in decision making? And I'm hoping by the end of today that we'll have a little bit more familiarity with that. So moving on now to understanding the meaning of preferences in healthcare decisions. In many healthcare areas, decisions are made either by patients, for us, the person with aphasia, and or clinicians in the face of competing sets of risks and benefits. So the need for trade-off of one thing over another when they are competing becomes very real. And the easiest way to understand that is thinking about cancer treatment. It's the clearest example of trade-offs because, depending on what intervention is chosen, people are making a trade-off often between length of life and quality of life, and values and personal preferences come into play. So the point that health economists make is that preference or value is always established by what someone is willing to sacrifice or trade off in weighing these up. It's actually something we can all consider in our personal decisions as well. So it's sometimes more accurate to talk about preference-sensitive decisions. And these are the ones that are involved when there are competing sets of risks and benefits. So that's why we call that process preference-sensitive. And it's different to more clear-cut areas. So for example, if you have a hip fracture, whether or not you're going to do surgery, there's not a huge variation in that. It's not as preference sensitive as some of our areas. The trade-offs are only relevant if there's really a dilemma and a choice. They are directly related to personal values. I'll give you another example. So research evidence indicates that for X disease, say today we could talk about prostate cancer, for example, prostate cancer screening. Years ago, the same was true for breast cancer screening, where the research actually shows that early detection doesn't necessarily prolong lifespan. So what option would you choose? Would you choose to be screened and tested and know the result? You might be the outlier person where it does make a difference. Or would you prefer to not be screened and then maybe have a better quality of life because you don't know and you're not living your remaining years with a diagnosis? So choices like this are based on your personal values and what you're prepared to sacrifice for them. In this case, we're talking about your risk tolerance. And what does this mean for aphasia? Is aphasia an area for preference-sensitive decision-making? Variation would indicate to me yes. What are the trade-offs in relation to aphasia treatment decisions? Can we measure what is valued by people with aphasia by finding a way to establish what they're prepared to sacrifice for it? In our case, it might be time with a therapist on one approach versus another. And should we do the same to really see what we value ourselves as individual speech-language pathologists? There are challenges in establishing preferences, and we've got to be careful that we are ensuring that what we're doing is helping to clarify preferences about the what, objectives or goals, versus the how, the list of specific methods. This is really important because you will hear in the literature, and you might already have this objection in your head, but people with aphasia or patients don't want to make the decision. They want us to make the decision or the expert. Often, as it's pointed out in the literature, this is because they're talking about the how. They don't have the background to have the list of specific methods. They're not saying that they don't have a preference in establishing their goals or their objectives. So it's an important distinction. Another challenge is actually providing a usable and accessible framework for the menu of potential options and deciding what these would be in aphasia. We would need to know how to support conversations on this complex topic and have the resources to do so. And we need to tap into the preferences of people with aphasia that takes individual values into account. So how do we get to better understand individual patient preferences? Well, our aim is, again, to solicit preferences about outcomes that are valued in the sense that the person is prepared to make a sacrifice of other outcomes. So think back to that cancer example. and then to provide enough support for the person with aphasia in understanding the trade-offs if this is something that we want to do. So a reminder again that we're talking about the objectives as opposed to the how. And if you are wanting to discuss preferences about how, it may be possible, but it needs to be at a level that makes sense in relation to the patient knowledge. And that, I guess, is a common sense thought. However, in the end, what we need to ensure is that we're measuring success in relation to those outcomes rather than measuring the means of getting there. And that is a whole other topic, of course. Do we need to plead guilty, us as speech-language pathologists, to paying lip service to the notion of patient preferences regarding treatment options? So not really providing clear information about risks and benefits, or maybe not giving the person with aphasia an opportunity to decide what they would sacrifice for a preference. It's not necessarily an either or, but it does always involve some sacrifice, because time spent on one thing means time not spent on another. And there may be other ways of compensating. For example, with impairment treatment, it might be done at home on a computer. There are many ways of doing it, but there is a sacrifice of some sort. And are we also guilty of not being familiar enough with the tools that are available in the field of healthcare? So this brings me to the topic of patient decision aids, PDAs. PDAs, I'm just going to go back to that slide. I hadn't heard about PDAs until I started diving into this literature. Maybe many of you have. I certainly hadn't. And what I found out is, as they're used in medicine, PDAs ideally help patients zero in on their preferences regarding treatment outcomes or objectives in relation to relative risk or sacrifice. So this is in contrast to most other economic evaluation methods that you may have heard of, including cost-effective analysis or cost-utility analysis, because these are designed for population health decisions, and they do not make a decision for a single patient, for a single person with aphasia, the person sitting in front of us. They're both useful, but they have completely different purposes. And as an aside, I can't resist making a comment about the same balance we need between our research on large populations, randomized trials, and research where we learn so much from individual and particular narratives, and the huge contribution of knowledge to our field with things like detailed case histories, because we know there's a tendency to undervalue the enormous contribution of what we learn from those studying individuals. And, two names come to my mind, of course, are Luria and Oliver Sacks. So the same actually applies to preferences of people with aphasia. There are many larger studies of what people with aphasia find valuable or what they want. And much of this valuable work comes from Australia. But this does not necessarily apply to the individual person with aphasia sitting in front of us, or in these times on our Zoom screen. So both have a place. They are both valuable, but they are not the same thing. What PDAs do, what they help us to do, is to be explicit about the decision that needs to be made for an individual. And if they are good PDAs, they provide information about options and outcomes and risks and benefits, and they help the person to clarify their own personal values. You might be interested to do your own lit search on PDAs and get an idea of what they look like. I was interested to see, just yesterday I was looking at this, and there are brand new PDAs now related to COVID-19 decisions. So for example, should you stay in a long-term care facility or move back with your family and others? So I took some screenshots of it. I'm not expecting you to read this, but just as an example of one that comes out from Canada, from Ottawa. The decision here is about moving from a retirement or assisted living home to the home of family or friends during the pandemic. They acknowledge at the top that it can be difficult, and then they provide steps, 5 steps for making this decision. And, this would be on the opening page. Obviously not aphasia friendly, and this is, one of my questions that I'll be asking you at the end is, do we want to start looking at tools like this? So it would go through questions of, where do you live now, etc. Then, in other steps, it would provide questions that help people clarify risks and benefits and information. So here it would be, can your personal nursing and medical needs be met 24/7 if you move home? And you would tick these things. And there are a few pages of this. And then there would be, the options would be made very clear. Option 1 is to stay in a retirement home or an assisted living home. And option 2 would be to go and live with your family or friends. So what you see on this screen, if you can read it, I know it's very small, what would be the reasons to choose this option? And then there's some reasons listed. And then what would be the reasons to avoid this option? And similarly for option 2. So that's an example of what a PDA could look like. I'm certainly not promoting this as an answer to all our prayers. There are definite limitations to PDAs. One of them being that they're often not updated with current information, the latest research, because they rely on updated systematic reviews. And we all know how long those take to get into the literature these days. And then, although they are supposedly designed to complement and not replace conversations with a healthcare practitioner, many are actually designed to be used independently. So if someone has got a particular problem, they'd go online and they would fill out one of these, and then it would help them to make a decision. So that's not the original intent of people who develop them, but some of them are used in that way. There's also no guarantee that clinical decision making is actually shared, and also no guarantee that it necessarily leads to patient-centered care. That involves those kinds of conversations we've been talking about. And sometimes an incorrect assumption made within the evidence-based practice paradigm that, if you're just using a PDA and you are kind of giving the research and the risks and benefits, that that guarantees patient-centered care. So we need to bear that in mind. But on the positive side, some of the newer aids are much simpler and designed to be used collaboratively. I was interested to find out that there are now apparently international PDA standards. There's also increased use of multimedia interactive tools, and some of these may be useful for us in aphasia. So do PDAs have an application for us? How different would things be if we started to incorporate tools like this to establish individual preferences regarding aphasia treatment? And this, by the way, is not, I'm not talking about replacing assessments. This is alongside or complements assessments that we do. It might help us choose what assessments we do as well. And then, is there an interest for us in adapting and developing these PDAs to improve personal understanding of aphasia treatment options? Quite a challenge. So all of this involves really a shift in paradigm, and medicine is starting to see some of these shifts. We're starting to see shifts from evidence-based practice, which purports to include patient values, the triangle that many of you, most of you I'm sure are familiar with it. It includes patient values and clinical expertise, but it prioritizes evidence, to more of a values-based practice approach, which still includes evidence. Okay, I think this is where we were, talking about the shifts in paradigms, and I think that I did start to talk about this when we kind of just lost the Zoom connection. That medicine is definitely starting to see some of these shifts from evidence-based practice to what's been called values-based practice. And it might really be time to be thinking very seriously about this because of the increasing complexity of decision making. On a societal level, a cultural level, just let's look at the technological changes and changes in general. Just look at the changes that we are all undergoing this year, and the year is not even halfway through. So there's increasing complexity in decision making, including in healthcare. And some examples of the shifts include the fact that there are now actually centers for values-based medicine. I think there's one in the US. Something else I only learned about recently is various iterations of what's called P medicine. Some of you might know this. I hadn't really heard about it. There's P4, P3, P4, P5, and recently P6, which are all the Ps that you see there on the screen. Very values-based. They're calls by some for evidence-based medicine to mature, so not necessarily replace it, but for it to mature and reincarnate itself. And there are also some really fascinating interdisciplinary collaborations that I've read about where they are using terms like values-based practice. There's one in the UK, our UK colleagues might be familiar with it, where there's a skills-based approach, a technique for actually applying the skills that a philosopher would use in their work to psychiatry and in issues related to mental health. And it's very much about values, establishing individual values and how you get at those, the individual values of the person, the individual values of the provider. And they actually regard this as evidence, that the values are part of the evidence-based as opposed to the way that we often think about evidence. So I'm going to skip some of what I said, just looking at the time and just circling back to some of the questions that I've asked throughout. And then I'll stop there and hopefully we can continue this, if not today, another time. So what do you think about the issue of second opinions and the potential role for a general practitioner for our field, bearing in mind that variation is a fact? Is aphasia an area for preference-sensitive decision-making? To what extent do we weigh up these risks, benefits, and trade-offs together with our patients? What are the trade-offs in relation to aphasia treatment decisions, and what level should we be making those decisions? What do we value as individual providers? And can we actually measure what is valued by people with aphasia by finding a way to establish what they are prepared to sacrifice for it? So in my conversations with health economists about this, a sacrifice might be a cost. So maybe you could do option B as well, but it costs more. Maybe you could do option B, but it means involving your family coming in for training. There's a host of sacrifices that we would be able to come up with. And then is there an interest in adapting and developing decision-making aids, PDAs, to improve personal understanding of aphasia treatment options? So this topic is, as I'm sure you've gathered, really, really a complex one. There are many aspects to it. My goal was to just introduce some questions and encourage you to spend some time on this literature. And then, as I had in my title, let's talk. So I think I'm going to end there.